23rd of March 2019. I was hoping to go over a couple things that happened back in between 58 and 63 with regards to global warming. A lot of people talk about it. It's in the news all the time, but nobody tries to revisit the actual history of it. And a lot of it's all open source, and there's a lot of interesting information controversy going on during the time. So a real quick look might help us out. It says the years of atmospheric testing was between 1945 and 1963. Now, this atmospheric testing is referring to nuclear atmospheric testing. Now, there's a series of atomic bombs that are set off in the atmosphere or very close to the ionosphere, which is the upper atmosphere, which is just really, really high. Now, if you remember in news that was released not too long ago, they suggested the moon was actually part of our atmosphere. So let's guess that all this stuff happened within our atmosphere, since the moon is a lot further than what we would have launched these missiles at. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and move on and find out, since 1958, about the same time that these testings were about to conclude, the last two testings being in 58 and the last one being in 62. In 1958, this observatory was opened up under the direction of the Charles Keeling. And this observatory was, the observatory is under the Earth Research Laboratory, which is part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. According to the NOAA, Mauna Loa is the world's oldest continuous CO2 monitoring station and the world's primary benchmark site for measurement of the gas. Now, if we're all aware that CO2 is definitely the component that they suggested global warming is, or the greenhouse gas that is causing global warming. So we got to keep in mind greenhouse gas, global warming. CO2 literally makes the ceiling that traps the heat in. Now, the one thing I'd like to point out at this point is there's a lot of talk about the gas that traps the heat that causes global warming, but nobody talks about the heat in global warming. Okay, so there's a big difference here. You have the gas that traps the heat, and then there's the heat. So what's the heat? Obviously, the heat would be part of the industrial process, volcanic activities, and a couple other things that were going on here, which I talked about just a second ago. Nuclear testing, atmospheric testing. So I'm not going to try to draw any conclusions here, because the total heat amount that's generated through these kind of explosions, I know they can have a factor. They can be a variable into a larger portion of what's going on, but we can't eliminate things that are happening. They're all part of a bigger picture. So I'm going to look at this individual named Charles Keeling real quick, and we'll see that he, right after his doctoral and his PhD, he was fortunate enough to land a job right away in the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And a lot of this was publicly funded. So you can dig even deeper. You can find out who was funding it. And there's another individual that was deeply involved. Here's the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, founded in 1903 out of San Diego, California. A lot of stuff coming out of California. And another influential person on developing global warming and this idea is Roger Revelle. And he was a scientist and scholar who were instrumental in formative years of University of California, San Diego. And among the early scientists to study this word here, which is essentially talks about the variables, the many variables on the Earth, global warming, as well as the movement of the Earth's tectonic plates. So that's interesting, because right now in our news and our Earth, we're dealing with the same issues. We're talking about global warming, and we're talking about earthquakes. So much of his early work in oceanography took place in Scripps Institution of Oceanography in San Diego. He was an oceanographer in the Navy during World War II, so some really close government ties there with the military. Eventually, he'd go on to be president of Scientific Committee on Ocean Research, an international group of scientists devoted to advising international projects, and he was frequent advisor to an Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission created in the 1960s. In July 56, Charles David Keeling joined the SIO staff to head the program and begin measurements of the atmospheric carbon dioxide at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Mauna Loa, Hawaii, and in Antarctica. There's a lot of interesting news coming out of Antarctica, and there's a lot of theories coming out of there too, so we have to be careful about that. So all this stuff happened in 1956, and it shows here that Revelle was instrumental in creating the International Geophysical Year. In 1958, was the founder and chairman of the first committee on the climate change. Okay, so 1958, we find out that again, the final 2 tests were done in oceanic testing by the U.S. government. 63 was the final test, I think 62 actually, and 58 was the second to final test. There's some work here that's interesting about Keeling. And here it says, in the early 1960s, National Science Foundation stopped supporting his research, calling the outcome routine. So initially, this stuff that was done on global warming, it was considered routine. Obviously, Roger had believed global warming might be a legitimate issue. But during the time of the 1960s, they were immediately already walking away from this kind of research. They didn't think it was relevant. They said despite the lack of interest, the foundation still used Keeling research in its warning in 1963 of rapidly increasing amounts of heat trapping gases. Okay, rapidly increasing amounts of heat trapping gases. So in 63, they're talking about heat-trapping gases. They're talking about global warming. But I have to reiterate, they are not talking about what is warming the Earth. And you see this other gentleman, like I said before, he had his research into tectonic plates. He did his research into CO2. But tectonic plates and global warming, okay? So there's a big gap between there. There's a lot of other things going on, and we're starting to find that out. 1965 report from President Johnson. That worries me. See, when I was reading this, I thought, wow, isn't there a president somewhere between 58 and 65? Kennedy? A 1965 report from President Johnson's Science Advisory Committee similarly warned of the dangers of extra heat-trapping gases which cause the temperature of the Earth to rise. So in 65, Johnson steps in. He starts to think it's important to talk about this. And we know Kennedy had a lot of things to say about the military-industrial complex. He had a lot of things to say the Missile-Cuban crisis. How come we don't really see him saying anything about any of this? And this was his presidency right here. And certainly Johnson would have known about anything the president was concerned about. And clearly Johnson says he's concerned about heat-trapping gases, not the production of heat, just the gases that are trapping the heat, which concerns me because things still create heat. The data collection started by Keeling and continued at Mauna Loa as the longest continuous atmospheric carbon dioxide in the world and is considered a reliable indicator of global trend in mid-level troposphere. That's a good term, troposphere. So it's not just the atmosphere. It looks like he's also looking at the troposphere. Keeling research showed that the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide grew from 315 parts per million 58. Okay, so they started to look at 58. They didn't look at it before 58. And we do know the nuclear testing was done and it finished up with the last two testings in 58, and the last testing was done in 62. And maybe a conclusion at 63. I don't know why they put 63 there, but I thought the last test was done in 62. We'll look at that here in just a second. So we don't know what the CO2 level was before that, but nonetheless, this is not measuring the amount of heat in a system. Now, I guess that's going to be difficult to determine in some sense because you can't really determine the amount of heat in a system easily. Maybe it's one of those things where you have to measure a lot of other things around heat. But nonetheless, global warming is surrounded by the CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide, and not the heat in the system. So, and if we measured it and we looked at it as heat in the system, we'd see that there are a lot of other factors generating heat. There has also been an increase in seasonal variation in samples from the 20th century to the 21st century, and I'm sure there is. I'm not saying there isn't. So I'll go on here and we'll talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which happened in 62. In November 4th, 1962. So this is the last atmospheric nuclear test conducted by the United States 55 years ago. That's right before 1963. 1963, we had a limited test ban treaty in 1963. And this, in fact, was what J.F. Kennedy was a part of. He signed this with the Soviet Premier Nikolai Khrushchev. Deep concern about the strength of their respective their nation's nuclear armed forces. Now, I would suggest that the heat is important in a system, so that even if you don't directly hit a target that's intended to be hit, you're still dispersing heat. And heat, even if it's not trapped in an extreme amount, even if the CO2 levels were at the same amount as 100 years ago, the barrier for heat to disperse, okay, even if the barrier for heat to disperse is back to where it was 100 years ago, the amount of heat that we're generating will always be more than 100 years ago because there's more people and there's more production and there's more activities going on. So there's actually two things that are at work here, and you're never going to hear them talk about the actual heat production, but just what's trapping the heat. And maybe it's not as important as I think it is, but I would guess it is, because when you're lighting a fire to, let's say, in a fireplace, you know, your insulation is going to be just as important as your heat source. So about the same time this pole shift stuff started coming about, and the CIA decided to classify a book that came out called The Adam and Eve Story. And this Adam and Eve story came out at the same time in 63. And there was also a book that came out, The Earth's Shifting Crust, at 58. Now we see what happened in 58. What was going on here? That was nearly the last nuclear atmospheric testing. Okay, so the very last one was in 62. So I don't think that's a coincidence, because you have only so much brain power, and you got to ask yourself what you're going to do with all this brain power. So one of these books was classified, which was called The Adam and Eve Story, and the other one, which was more closely worked with the CIA, was actually released, called The Earth's Shifting Crust in 1958 by a gentleman, I should say a doctor, with the name of Haplog. Now, the interesting thing about Haplog is he ended up working alongside another scientist, and he actually co-authored the book with it. And I'm going to put this site here up so you can take a look at it. This stuff is pretty interesting, and it still has its relevance today. Can't really find it, but his co-author was Einstein. Okay, here we go. Hapalog, along with Albert Einstein, who wrote the preface to Hapalog's 1958 book, believed that the accumulation of ice on the North and South Pole would be the trigger for a crustal displacement, geopole shift. Einstein explained that a triggering mechanism as follows. Essentially, they got rid of that as an idea, and they decided that a geophysical pole shift, which is critical because right now we're dealing with a magnetic pole shift. A geophysical pole shift would probably happen. After eliminating this, Hapalog decided it was probably the result of something else going on inside the Earth. Now, the science on this, on what really causes a pole shift, or a magnetic pole shift, let alone what will cause a geophysical pole shift, is still unknown. So we still don't know what's going on. But what I'd like to bring your attention to is the dates. We have a 1958 study that's coming out just at the end of atmospheric nuclear testing. Now, do I believe that nuclear testing can cause pole shifts in some sort of dramatic way or any way at all? Not really. I don't. And I'll even show some information that suggests that I wouldn't think this, but it's still any possibility is still out there. I mean, I don't know the math on it, so shortly here I'm going to go over the armor of God. Thanks for joining me on the curve.